One little girl isn't playing nice. All this week, we've been sharing local ghost stories and the history that comes
Family
with
is at threat, in danger.
Well, I think there are different types of things going on in this house. I wouldn't think there's one explanation. The bears appearing in the middle of the room is a playful type poltergeist experience. But the scratches on the man's stomach and his arm, and according to his testimony, he was yanked out of his bed. Those are pretty terrifying experiences. And yes, I'm a little concerned
Definitely
about
gives me the willies.
Even the professionals are wary of this. A little girl named Sally now roams free.
When you think about the paranormal in places you see often on TV and hear about, there's a few that may come to mind. Some of those places are active with many spirits who don't mean any harm, while others might have more vengeful haunts still lingering. But what about places that have been called demonic? Well, this week we're about to dive into the history of 508 North 2nd Street, aka the infamous Sallie House. Hey guys, I'm Chelsea, and welcome back to another episode of Miss Mystery Productions Macabre Manifestations. We're back this week with another history lesson, and this time we're talking about a place that you've probably heard of. Let's get into it. Founded in 1854, Atchison, Kansas is a small town that sits on the banks of the Missouri River and is about an hour outside of Kansas City, Missouri. Atchison is famous for being the birthplace of Amelia Earhart, and visitors can go and visit the home she was born in. Each July, the city of Atchison puts on an entire Amelia Earhart festival, and it's a widely popular event. While we could talk about Amelia at length, we're here to talk about another legend that happens to sit right up the road from where Amelia was born. In 1867, Michael Croman Finney, or MC Finney for short, began construction on a new home in Atchison. He owned lots 9 and 10, which are now home to 504 and 508 North 2nd Street. Construction was completed in 1871, and MC moved his family into the unassuming brick home. Around 10 p.m. on September 27, 1872, MC passed away inside of the house, thus marking the first documented death inside the Sallie House. MC left behind his wife, Catherine, who went by Kate, and his children, James K. Finney, Agnes Marie Finney True, Charles C. Finney, and an unborn son named Richard E. Finney. You might want to remember those names, as they'll all come into play again as our tale progresses. One interesting thing that I do want to note is that the Sallie House now sits backwards. Originally, there was a first street that ran through Atchison, much like all the other roads, but a large portion of that ended up being swept away in a flood. The area of the street that was impacted does indeed include the Sallie House. The original front of the house is now the back of the house, and vice versa. So in other words, the back door located in the kitchen was originally the front door of the home. The front porch area of the house you now see was added later on when that became the front of the home. It's important to note because for those of you who know the stories about the Sallie House origin, you might be familiar with the next segment that we're going to discuss. But I did just want to bring this up because I'm sure a lot of people who know the legend, such as myself, might have had a hard time visualizing the layout and making sense of what was happening in the home at the time. I wanted to share this fact about the house and the way that it sits to this day is because it'll help make sense of things a bit more, and it's also something that I haven't really heard a lot of people discuss, to be honest. I know that the podcast, Astonishing Legends, spoke about the home's original layout, but aside from them, I honestly feel like I haven't seen or heard much about this, and it's certainly useful information to have as we continue on throughout our story. Anyways, back to the Finney family. I do want to say that we could talk about the family and their ownership of both homes on North 2nd Street, but we'd be here for hours. I personally did some pretty exhaustive research, and it would take me a while to share and explain everything with you guys. In order to help kind of keep things shorter, I won't be doing too deep of a dive into their history, but I do want to mention a little bit about the Finneys, and that'll kind of help to tie things together a bit more. Kate Finney, MC's wife, had her father living with the Finney family. Kate's father, Charles James Catherines, spent his adult life as a music teacher. On July 14th, 1874, Charles James Catherines died inside of the home, thus becoming the second death to occur within the Sallie House. as far as the Finney kids go, I'd like to touch on James first, as James is actually the one who built 504 North 2nd Street, which is the home right next door to the Sallie House. James did eventually move to St. Louis to pursue a sales career, and he ended up deeding 504 to his mother. And he died on February 18th, 1900 in Leavenworth, Kansas. Now, back in Atchison in 1899, that home was then deeded to a woman named Joanna Barnes, who was pregnant at the time. Right before moving in, Joanna was declared mentally unstable and was institutionalized in Topeka. In July of 1899, she gave birth to her son, Frank, and it was ordered that she was released into the care of Dr. Charles Finney, which meant that Johanna and Frank were moved back into their original home of 504 North 2nd Street. On April 18th, 1906, Joanna deeded 504 to Agnes Finney and moved to Kansas City. Just as a little bit of a segue here, I do want to note that on September 24th, 1906, Joanna turned on the gas in her downstairs home and laid down within her son in an attempt to take her life. Joanna survived, but Frank sadly did not. Even though 504 is not the Sallie House, nor did this tragedy occur in Atchison. It is interesting that Joanna had such close ties to the Finney family. Now, on to Agnes Finney. In 1913, Agnes married a gentleman named William True, who was a railroad engineer. The couple lived together in Rouleau, Nebraska. In December of 1916, William suffered a stroke of paralysis, and Agnes made the call to move the two of them back down to Atchison, as she thought that William might get better medical care there. William was unconscious for 3 days before he died on May 4th, 1918 at 7 p.m. inside of 508 North 2nd Street. Upon the death of William, Agnes lived out the remainder of her life in the Sallie House, and in order to help pay bills, she took in boarders who stayed in the home as well. Agnes did become ill, and on midnight, November 28, 1939, Agnes died inside the Sallie House. Richard was born on May 25, 1873, and died on September 29, 1874, at the young age of around 16 months. So, unfortunately, there isn't much information on him. Some people state Richard did also die inside of the Sallie House, but I wasn't able to find anything concrete to confirm the validity of this. Okay, so let's go ahead and start discussing Charles C. Finney, or C.C. Finney specifically. He was a medical doctor. He eventually became the mayor of Atchison, and interestingly enough, he was a figure skater. Believe it or not, but Charles actually used to dress as a woman, and he would compete under the name of Miss Colby of Baltimore. He was so graceful on skates that nobody ever realized Miss Colby of Baltimore was actually Charles Finney. Pretty crazy, right? Charles, who often was called Charlie by his friends, started his career as a bookkeeper for another doctor in the area, Dr. Dan Holland. Charles eventually did become Dr. Holland's office assistant, and it was Dr. Holland who suggested that Charles should probably study medicine, which he eventually did. Charles received his degree from Beaumont Hospital Medical College in 1894, and once he had that, he opened a general practice in the downtown area of Atchison. What's crazy to me is that from the moment the home was built until 1939, a member of the Finney family had continuously lived in the home. For roughly the next 53 or so years, people moved in and out of the home, but there was no real major instances or reports of anything paranormal that were happening. However, reports started coming out in 1992, but more on that later. For now, you at least have a small taste of the backstory of the Finneys, and with that, it's time to tell a tale that many of you will be familiar with, the supposed origin of Sallie. While residing in 508 North 2nd Street, Dr. Charles Finney had a medical practice located inside of the home. There were offices downstairs, and his family actually lived upstairs. The living room and dining room areas probably would have served as patient examination areas or things of that nature. The rumor goes that one night, a woman rushed into the home with her 6-year-old daughter, supposedly named Sallie. The little girl was in excruciating abdominal pain, and the mother was desperate. Dr. Finney examined the girl and quickly realized her appendix was about to burst. So he decided to perform an emergency appendectomy on the little girl. Due to the severity of the situation, it's said that Dr. Finney had no choice but to begin operating before Sally's anesthesia had fully kicked in. The little girl died on the operating table, screaming in fear and writhing in pain. Her last moments probably consisted of thinking she was being tortured and mutilated by a man she had never met. While this is the most common rumor, there are plenty of other versions of the story floating around too. Some state that Charles Finney was having an affair and Sally was his child, so he did the surgery at home instead of a hospital. This way, nobody would be privy to his extramarital affairs. Others have stated that Charles Finney killed both his child and his mistress. This way, nobody would find out about them. It could certainly be possible, considering he would have had the tools and the skills to dismember a body. Others, they tend to think that none of this occurred and that there never was a Sally being operated on in the home. After all, there really isn't any solid evidence of proof of a 6-year-old girl named Sally getting emergency surgery in the home. Most people who don't believe in the little girl appendectomy theory do tend to think that Sally might be something far more malevolent in nature. That brings me back around to when I mentioned earlier that things in the house were seemingly quiet until 1992, when a young family moved in as tenants. In the winter of 1992, Tony and Deborah Pickman moved into 508 North 2nd Street. They were newly married, Deborah was pregnant, and they were excited about starting their lives together. You know, at first there wasn't really anything paranormal that happened, but the Pickmans did begin to notice some strange cold spots. Their animals were acting oddly, and lights would dim as if they were on a dimmer. It seemed that once their son was born, the activity began to pick up further and even became violent. The Pickmans were even featured on Sightings, a first-run syndication television show on Fox Network. There are countless of things that happened to the Pickmans, and I highly recommend watching the Sightings episodes for yourself if you haven't already. We could spend days talking about things that the Pickmans experienced in the home, but I know we don't have days on end to chat. I do, however, want to give just a brief overview of a few of the reoccurring things and a few more specific things that Tony and Deborah had happen during their time in the Sallie House. One of the first stories that I always tend to think about is that of what the Pickmans experienced in their son's nursery. As with any nursery, there are lots of toys and stuffed animals located in the room. On July 14th, 1993, the Pickmans and Deborah's sister, Karen, who was visiting from out of town, noticed that a bunch of stuffed animals were arranged in a circle on the nursery floor. They assumed it was someone in the group kind of playing a prank on one another, so they put the toys back, shut the lights off, and returned downstairs. Upon returning back upstairs moments later, the toys had been arranged again in a weird circle on the floor. The family's dog often refused to enter the nursery and it would growl. It is important to note that the Pickmans did say sometimes the dog would enter the nursery as well with no problems at all. Tony also had a frightening experience one night while in bed, in which furniture began moving around and a woman with black lace sleeves was approaching him yelling, "I'm gonna." Tony also had seen a woman in older period clothing going upstairs and disappearing into the back bedroom. But the woman's face looked strikingly like Deborah, even though it wasn't her. Perhaps the most interesting thing is that one day, Tony had been getting himself a glass of orange juice out of the fridge. And when he turns, there was a spirit of a little girl standing there, looking quite frightened. Tony dropped the glass and ran upstairs, where he actually began to draw what he had seen. Without getting too deep into this, I do also want to share some common oddities that happened to the Pickmans, much of which can be seen in the Sightings episodes. Tony experienced scratches. Some were light, and others were deep enough to draw blood. These mysterious scratches would materialize out of absolutely nowhere. They also experienced objects moving, including an instance of an oil lamp being picked up to be thrown, only to be set back down. Tony was often burned in the home, and there were random isolated fires that would start in random locations, such as window frames, a rose, and a mop head doll, just to name a few. At one point, Tony almost felt like he could have been possessed, as he began having urges to harm Deborah and to get her out of the house. The Pickmans brought in experts to try and help cleanse the home, but it seemed like absolutely nothing would work. Okay, so let's now tie in everything we know so far to the name Sallie. One of the first times the name Sallie was mentioned was back in 1990 and also again in 1994. Bobby and Colleen Humbird moved into 508 North 2nd Street. Oddly enough, from 504 North 2nd Street, right next door. They had a daughter named Heather, and Heather was always playing with her imaginary friends. Heather indicated that her imaginary friend was named, as you guessed it, Sallie. After everything that happened with the Pickmans, Heather was actually presented with the picture of Sallie that Tony drew, and Heather identified the little girl in the picture to be that of her former friends. The Pickmans also picked up on the name Sallie as well. A coworker of Tony's mentioned that his sister, Barbara Connor, had some psychic abilities and maybe she could try and go out to visit the house and make contacts. Barbara did indeed go to the home, and she did indeed make contact with a little girl named Sallie. Sallie told Barbara that she was 7 years old, she had stomach pains, a pain in her hands, and a really bad toothache. Sallie also supposedly said that Deborah was bossy and had way too many rules. The name Sallie came up again during the third episode of Sightings, in which they brought in well-known psychic Peter James. Peter had been told absolutely nothing about the property or what was happening prior to his arrival. Peter hadn't even stepped into the home, and when he looked up, he said he saw the face of a little girl looking out from an upstairs window. Upon walking in, Peter immediately picked up on the spirit of a small girl at the top of the staircase, and he mentioned her name was Sallie. He indicated that there were at least 3 individuals who died in the home, and he even picked up on something medical related, wondering if maybe someone happened to work in the medical field who had once lived in the home. The sightings team did also bring Peter to a cemetery that he felt drawn to, and upon his arrival, he felt called to an old gravesite that was so old you couldn't even read the tombstone. And that actually turned out to be the grave of Sallie Elizabeth Hall, who had died in 1905. However, that particular Sallie was of African American descent, and she was born in 1871 and supposedly gave birth to 14 children. So she doesn't quite match the description of what people think the little girl actually looks like. Another notable instance spans back to 1948 when the Mize family was renting the home. They had a daughter whose name was Sarah Margaret Mize, but her nickname was Sallie. Based on my research, I believe she's still alive to this day. So, provided none of the emergency surgery stories are true, if something is pretending to be a little girl named Sallie, could it have liked Sarah Margaret Mize's nickname so much that it decided to use it for itself? This brings me to a point in which I think it's time to discuss some more of the negative energies that are in the home. Some people would even claim that this house is demonic. People also claim that they think the house is some type of a portal that allows entities from the spirit world to enter our physical realm and back and forth. Upon the Pickmans moving out, the Sallie House became home to another tenant. While there were only minor paranormal things that happened to this particular tenant, it's very important to note what occurred there. The landlord at the time, who actually still owns the home, Les, got wind that the woman wasn't keeping up with the home the way that she needed to. Upon his arrival to inspect the home, Les found that she wasn't maintaining things and that the house was in a rough state. Upon going into the basement, Les found that a pentagram had been painted on the basement floor. Reports claim that there was a cauldron down there too, but Les denied seeing that in the Astonishing Legends podcast. But he did recall a wreath hanging by the opening of the hole in the basement wall. He did state that it could have been a Christmas wreath though, and he didn't particularly pay that much attention. Les removed that tenant from the home at the time. Since then, Les has painted over the pentagram in the basement to try and conceal it. As with anything of this nature, rumors swirled, and people have assumed there might have been animal sacrifices, as you can supposedly see blood under UV lighting in the master bedroom closet. While others claim that there were candles and other ritualistic items found in the house during this woman's time. Nobody knows for sure what was happening in the home during that period. So yeah, while that was a lot to unload, it's just a small bit of the legend of the Sallie House in Atchison, Kansas. If you're interested, I do highly recommend doing some research yourself and seeing what else you can find out. Also, I guess this would be a good time to tell you that the Sallie House will be a 3-part series of episodes. As always, we'll start with a surface level history lesson, followed by our paranormal investigation, and the third episode will be a post-investigation discussion with Brendan, Elena, and myself, in which we'll kind of talk about some behind-the-scenes things we didn't capture on camera, our thoughts and feelings, and we'll discuss any evidence that we think might be compelling. Without giving away too much, I will say that we did actually end up leaving the night of our investigation. This is the first time both Brendan and myself felt genuine fear for our safety. We did go back pretty early in the morning, like prior to 6 a.m. to continue investigating, and we still caught some insane evidence. I'll leave you guys with this. The Sallie House is no joke. And with that said, this concludes episode 1 of 3 on the Sallie House. Thank you so much for joining us, and be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that little bell icon. This way you'll be notified when our investigation goes live. We'll see you then.